Right, okay, well, thank you very much to everyone for joining this session today. You are, of course, very welcome. We are absolutely delighted to have been asked to support a CIPD again in relation to their seminar programme, and we're looking forward to the session with you. So just moving on to what we intend to cover today. We're going to look at some of the specific issues which have come from COVID-19, some ideas of how to support employee wellbeing, the legal framework, of course, that employers have to be aware of, and then we're going to finish off with some tips on managing absence. We also want to hear from you all, and to do that we're going to use Menti, which Rebecca's already mentioned to you. It will therefore be helpful if you do have your phone to hand, but we'll give you more instructions when we come to that. So just moving the slides along, the impact of COVID-19. I think firstly, looking at the COVID impact, it is worth first a reminder of what is mental health. And I think we've got that set out on the next slide. So what is mental health? Well, Acas define it as our emotional, psychological and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel and act, and how we cope with the normal pressures of everyday life. So I think it's fair to say everyone has mental health. It varies for everyone all of the time to some degree or other, not always resulting in a need for additional support, but I'm sure we can all testify to having periods of time when we felt better mental health than at others. And clearly the period of the pandemic, I think, has tested everyone to some extent. So what about stress? What is stress? Well, the adverse reaction people have to excessive pressures or other types of demands placed on them. And that's the HSE's definition. So just moving on the slides again, please, Amy. Looking at the potential causes of stress at work, and this is in the COVID pandemic view, if you like. How has it impacted on our health and the levels of stress that people have had to cope with at work? Well, some of the examples we've heard about or indeed experienced ourselves are set out on the slides, and it really has brought a real mix of issues to the fore. Working from home has obviously brought benefits for some, but its own set of challenges. I'm sure there's many people on the call who've had to double up with homeschooling, for instance. Furlough, being worried about whether you still have a job at the end. And then at the other end of the scale, some people have been absolutely swamped with work, but perhaps without the usual support they would have had around them in the workplace. We've also seen the more vulnerable in particular worried about returning to the workplace, getting on public transport, doing some of the things that we've always previously taken entirely for granted. And this is just the work-related issues. So we can move on to the next slide, Amy, please. What about the potential causes of stress outside work? Well, again, they've been massive, haven't they? We've listed here some of the pressures that we've seen, and essentially all of these impact your staff, and they bring those issues, of course, into the workplace with them. So the childcare responsibilities I've already mentioned, some people having really minimal social contact and perhaps becoming even more reliant on work for that kind of contact with other people. Bereavement, of course, financial worries, the health difficulties. It is a long list of additional pressures that have been really come to the fore with COVID-19. So all in all, a pretty challenging time, I think, for people to cope with. Someone commented to me a few months ago that we're all in the same storm, but we're not all necessarily in the same boat. And I think that's a really good way of reminding people that everyone has and continues to have different challenges and may react with different levels of resilience to the specific pressures that they're facing at the moment. So we've already highlighted that we're going to try something different today with Menti and really aim to get some great visual feedback from you all. So Amy, I wonder if you can put up the details, please, for Menti, and we can explain how we're going to do this. So we mentioned having your phone, or you may be able to double up on your current device, but we'd ask if you could access Menti. You can either do this by scanning the QR code you can see in front of you now, or by putting www.menti.com into your web browser. You'll also see there's a code then that you need to enter. That's on the slide, and I think Rebecca is also putting that into the chat for you. Just give you all a few moments to be able to do that. That's great. We can see some of the words coming through. Work being a real challenge. Trust, that's an interesting one. I wonder whether that's trust in the government, in what we're being told, perhaps, in your employer. Just give that a bit longer while you all vote, with people are getting onto the site. I think about half of you have put something in there. There's a lot there, isn't there? I mean, there really is. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for participating in that. We'll just give a couple of seconds. There's just a few people just adding their thoughts. Trust and work remaining the really key words that are coming through there. Stress, we're mentioning that. We're obviously going to look at that today. Thank you. Just letting the last few people who want to participate do so. That's great. Thank you so much for participating in that one. We've got another question for you, Amy, if you're able to move that on. I appreciate there's a few people still voting, but I'm conscious of time. So this is directed at the number of employees who've required extra support in your businesses. The voting is entirely anonymous, so we're not going to see who's voted specifically. So please do feel free to post that on as honestly as you can. So the votes are coming through. It's looking like we're likely to have a clear winner here in terms of people spotting a real increase in employees requiring support for mental health. I don't suppose that any of us on this session are surprised at that. What is good is that so many of you are identifying that, and as such, I suspect many people have received additional support, which is great. What might be useful on the chat is if if there's anything in particular that your organisation has done, and you might want to share that with other people who are on the session, please do put that in the chat. It's not just for us. Be good to share that. And Pilly's going to pick up shortly about well-being and the type of support that we've seen with going out from businesses. That's great. Amy, I wonder if you'd like to move on to our final question. So here, if you again, some of you may have already put this in the chat, but you can put this now into a bubble on Menti. Let us know what you've done to promote mental well-being within your organisation, and try and assist those employees who you're aware, and indeed who you're not aware. And obviously it has become more difficult to identify who is having these problems when they're remote working. It takes an awful lot more effort by employers to get to the bottom of what's going on when you're not seeing people every day. EAP there really coming to the fore.
Well, even if they didn't, surely I'll have a look, because I'll have a look at Francis's CV and stuff, because I'll be intrigued.
Apologies for that. Amy, are you able to scroll down so people can see some of that's great? Thank you. Some great ideas there. A lot more mention of mental first aid than we would have seen 12 months ago, even though it was being spoken about prior to the lockdown. But I can see that really has taken off by the looks of things. That's great. I'm sure CIPD may be able to share some of these ideas that we've gathered here today with everybody attending. Some really super ideas. Thank you for sharing all of those. Amy, I wonder if we could close that off. That's great, thank you. And Pilly, could you perhaps pick up the slides, please?
Thank you, Sarah. So we'll now take a look at ways in which managers can support employee well-being. And the most effective way of doing this is going to be through communication. And I noticed that was one of the bigger words on the first Menti slide. There are two strands to this. The first is through sharing information about existing wellbeing support. We can, you can have the most fantastic resources for staff, but do they know where they can find them? Are they on the intranet, for example? Do all staff have access to the intranet, or do we need to look at how we can reach all staff? Do we need to keep reminding staff of what's on offer? Let's not forget, we might be moving towards the end of lockdown, but the effects of the past 12 months are likely to be felt for some time yet. The second strand is actual communication, which will be at its most effective where managers create an atmosphere where staff feel they are comfortable in raising an issue. And again, I'm noting how we saw on Menti that trust is a big issue at the moment. A way to do this is to really encourage check-ins on both a group and individual basis, where managers listen to staff. Those can be discussions around what actual pressures does that individual member of staff face, both at work and at home. What is it that they value from their job? Is there something that we can promote there? And also, I think importantly, what is their feedback on the support that's actually available? Needs can change. Is what is being offered fit for purpose? Is the support offered, for example, internally consistent across the organisation? We don't know if we don't ask. So those are important questions to think about as well. Moving on, the next main issue is, of course, flexibility. And that's a big way of being able to support staff during what are potentially very, very challenging times. What we've all learned, I think, over the past 12 months is that work can be carried out in many areas extremely flexibly in ways which suit both the needs of an organisation and also the needs of the individual. And organisations have had to accept and potentially have to continue to accept going forward that staff may, for example, need to take emergency dependent leave, which, don't forget, is a statutory right and often one of those policies pre-COVID, which I think, to be fair, was probably seldom exercised. This could be leave to arrange childcare or caring needs which have been disrupted without warning. Staff may need to use holiday to help, but also including simply needing time to deal with the stress of the current situation we all find ourselves in. And of course, ultimately working more flexibly not just now, but potentially going forwards. And that takes us to considering policies and training. So in terms of flexibility, if any policy that you have has been tested the most in the past 12 months, it's likely to be your flexible working policy. Was it actually fit for purpose looking back over the last 12 months? And is it actually fit for purpose now and going forward? So as people come back into the workplace, the prediction is that people will want to continue to work flexibly. But what does that mean for your organisation? Is your policy? Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. If people are saying that you've got a bit of an echo, can you just try and move your microphone a little bit? Let's see if that improves it.
Let me take this. If I take this off, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think that might be a bit better. Yeah, there's some feedback coming through that people can hear you better now. Sorry to interrupt you.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yeah. Oh, I think it might be better without the mic.
Is that right? I'll take it off. No problem. Is that better now?
Yeah. Yeah, people are saying yeah.
Excellent. I will go with that. I will go without the microphone. Right. Okay. Let me just think up where I was up to. Okay. So flexible working policies. So is your policy up to the challenge? And what we're talking about is a significant number of staff all wanting to make potentially permanent changes to their contracts of employment in order to work flexibly going forwards. So I would suggest that now is the time really to be thinking about this if you haven't started already. And from June onwards, that might bring different challenges to what we've seen over the past 12 months. And then let's just move to training for a moment. So in terms of training, have managers had adequate training to deal with mental health issues that their staff are facing? Do staff themselves understand how their colleagues may be feeling and what is, and importantly, what is not acceptable behaviour and approaches to those facing such issues? And importantly, how do managers practically support staff remotely? Are systems in place, such as microphones that work, to allow this to happen and to continue to allow this to happen? And I think there's a comment on the chat actually about managers are struggling to do this because this isn't something that they're used to having to deal with, potentially on a weekly basis. So if we move to the next slide, and what we've just set out on this slide is some examples of what we're doing at Mills and Reeve to help support staff. So you'll be able to look at those in terms of the presentation in your own time there. So if we just move on to the specific role of HR. So how can HR assist with all this? Well, talking to those managers, as we've identified on the chat, they'll need support. How are their teams doing? Is there a member of their team who might require more tailored assistance, for example? And what resources can we direct managers to? Is there any other support managers need to help them deal with the issues? Of course, HR is going to also be called upon to deal with the more complex situations. And we've sort of set out three important ones here, really, that special care will need to be taken with staff who've got pre-existing mental health conditions, for example. They'll need to be managed more carefully. And of course, HR will be assisting with occupational health referrals. And I saw from Menti that we're doing those more frequently and quicker. And also any employee assistance offering as well. We're probably accessing that support more. And importantly, I think managers are having to have sensitive conversations that they're just not used to having. So they might need assistance there. It might feel awkward. They need to think about how they approach these kind of conversations and how to have them both sensitively and also effectively. So we'll see on the next slide that we set out some questions to ask, and these can be shared with your managers. And I think there's some great questions there to help them have a script, almost a basic script of how to approach what are going to be quite challenging conversations for them that they're not used to potentially having to do. So I'll now hand back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Pilly. So we've talked a lot so far about the issues and challenges, and thank you for populating the chat with some of the ideas that you've all been having and some of the challenges. That's really helpful, I think, to everybody who's on. However, we are lawyers. We can't also help but remind you about the legal framework that you also need to be aware of. So if we can have the next slide, please, Amy. So an employer's duty of care. So what is that? Well, it's to support employees' health, safety and well-being, to make sure staff can work safely and healthily. That includes carrying out risk assessments, protecting staff from discrimination, and of course, making reasonable adjustments for those with a disability. And trust and confidence essentially underpins everything. I mentioned disability, and clearly it's important to be aware of when mental health may amount to a disability. So if we look at that, let's have a look at the reminder of the legal definition of disability. There are 4 key points that have to be answered. Does the person have a physical or mental impairment? Does that impairment have an adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? Is that effect substantial, and is that effect long-term? Now, mental impairments can include all chronic or acute mental health conditions, whether they have organic or an environmental cause. And we probably see stress, anxiety and depression being the most common that are generally experienced. Obviously, there are people with other mental health conditions that get reported, but they are the most common. So you always need to consider whether an employee who's suffering from mental ill health may be disabled under the Equality Act. Now, medical evidence can help, and we're going to mention that a few times before we finish the session today, but it is the legal assessment that counts for the purposes of the legislation. It also tends to be harder to be clear on mental impairments rather than physical impairments. Not least the individual themselves does not always identify with their mental health problems clearly. Now, there is, however, some guidance, and if we move on to the next slide. Work-related stress. So, case law distinguishes between symptoms of low mood and anxiety, where it's caused by clinical depression, which is more likely to be a disability, or a medicalisation, there's a good word for you, of work problems or adverse life events, where it's less likely, maybe unlikely, to be a disability. So let's consider stress in a little bit more detail. A common word to appear on a doctor's fit note. So the first thing is that this case is helpful towards employers in that it gives you the indication that stress does not automatically mean a disability. So in this case, Harry's stress was held to be related to the work situation, but the EAT gave some guidance to explain what would not necessarily count as a mental impairment. So unhappiness with a decision or colleague, a tendency to nurse grievances, or a refusal to compromise do not in themselves translate into mental impairments. The focus you have to take is on the effect on normal day-to-day activities in all aspects of life. So how do you approach these issues in reality? Let's have a look at our practical tips. So I mentioned the fact that it is a legal assessment, that's that legal definition that counts in terms of determining whether somebody is covered by the equality legislation. However, good, clear occupational health input is really important. And most important is getting the employee's treating doctor, whether that be GP and or consultant, to also provide input. What's rarely helpful is where you set up for an employee to see occupational health, and the only input occupational health has is the employee's own input. It's far better and provides far stronger information to the employer if you've also got the GP and/or consultant feeding into that report. Now, in borderline cases and with mental health, there are a lot of cases where it's not clear to call as to whether an individual is likely to be protected by the Equality Act. You will have to make a judgment call on the approach you're going to take. But disability discrimination cases, which include a failure to make reasonable adjustments, can lead to uncapped compensation. So generally, a more cautious approach is recommended. It's not the area to be really bullish in without taking a really quite high level of risk. Pilly, do you want to pick it up there?
Hi, sorry, apologies that I'm having sound issues here. Hopefully you can hear me okay now. Okay, so I'm going to deal with the duty to make reasonable adjustments. So the first thing to think about is, when does it apply? And it applies where there is a provision, criterion or practice which puts a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage. And this is often referred to as a PCP. But what does that mean? Well, that includes formal and informal practices, policies, and also arrangements. And with reasonable adjustments, the duty arises importantly where the employer has knowledge that the individual has a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act, or would be reasonably expected to know. So to give an example, it doesn't just mean from the point where you have an occupational health report confirming a disability, because circumstances may dictate that managers knew before that point that the individual was encountering issues, and the duty may therefore have arisen earlier. So moving on to the next slide, that we've set out on this slide some examples of adjustments in a mental health context. So you'll see we've got phased return to work after time off, changes to start and finish times, extra supervision and support from managers. These are all different things, different adjustments that can be made to someone's role to allow them to continue to effectively work in that role. So moving to the next slide, the next issue to consider really is, how does the duty apply to home working, which is a situation the vast majority of people find themselves in at the moment? Well, it's essentially the same as if you were in the workplace. So as you would with any adjustment, you need to check that it's still fit for purpose. So in the context we find ourselves in at the moment, does the adjustment that assists in the workplace work in a home working context? Does there need to be perhaps some more thought here because the member of staff is working from home? There needs to be that clear discussion with the individual. And you'll see we've given an example on the slide where the employee is deaf or hearing impaired, and you can see what adjustments would assist in that respect. So that's a good example. In terms of practical tips, well, I think the point with reasonable adjustments, and it's an important point, is that the clue is in the title. It has to be a reasonable adjustment. This is not just about any adjustment that's being suggested as having to be agreed with. An organisation needs to consider and should consider whether it will be reasonable in the first place to put that adjustment in place. And one of the key questions really that sometimes gets overlooked is whether the adjustment actually removes the disadvantage. And don't be scared of looking at that and keeping that continuous dialogue with staff and having a conversation about whether that adjustment is actually fit for purpose. Does it do what we want it to do? And remember, cases will depend on their own facts, so you do need to explore those and be confident that you can do so. One of the most important points I think we see from a tribunal perspective is about being consistent with adjustments. You don't want to really be in a position where staff have been treated differently, requesting the same adjustment in the same circumstances, as that in itself could give rise to a potentially discriminatory treatment. So, of course, one of the ways you need to sort of keep on top of what adjustments are being put in place is to keep records of those, so you know that there is a consistent approach across the organisation. I'll now hand back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Pilly. So moving on, so some additional tips on managing short and long-term absences. Well, I think the first thing to say is to bear in mind that Equality Act claims can arise just as easily when managing short-term as managing long-term absence. So we need to try and avoid the common mistakes. So we've gathered those on the next slide for you, the ones that we've seen. Firstly, failing to get OH advice at all. I can see from the chat that there's certainly a number of you on the call that are not going to make that mistake. But yeah, failing to get OH advice, the medical input is absolutely key. Sorry about the Labrador, working from home, what can you do? Ignoring medical evidence and advice, that's the other thing. Basically putting, sorry, I am just going to do something with the dog. Apologise, I shall be 1 second.
That could very well be the postman, probably.
I do apologise for that. When we're back in the office, we will not have such issues. So
seamless, Sarah.
Oh, do you know, apologies to everyone. Hopefully that's at least given you a laugh for the morning. Ignoring medical advice, that's the other thing. We do see clients who've done the right thing. They've got the occupational health advice, but then it looks too tricky or difficult to take on board, or it gets lost, or I don't really know what happens. But obviously if you've got that advice and evidence, do use it. Agreeing a plan and not implementing it. If you've gone to the effort of making the plan, follow it through. Not necessarily without changing it, of course, but you know, if you had a good plan, then that usually is the way to go. And the other thing to bear in mind, and you know, we've all, I'm sure, come across some employees who are perhaps not as honest in terms of what's going on with them as we might like. But the worst thing you can do is give the impression that you don't think the condition is not genuine. And particularly with mental health, one of the things that you will see is that the individual does not always have an understanding themselves of their condition, and that's part of the condition itself. So try and avoid those common mistakes. So what should we do? So dealing with short-term absence, consider cases individually. Obviously don't assume that you've seen this before and there is just one approach to it. Look for patterns, investigate the reasons for absence. Return to work interviews are really helpful. They're such a simple thing, but they are really helpful in getting under the skin of what might be going on with your staff. And when looking at triggers, do consider if they need to be adjusted. They might need to be to take into account a disability, but don't feel you need to totally discount disability related absence. You are still able to take that into account. You obviously have to do it carefully and appropriately, but totally discounting it is not necessary. And we have seen some cases where staff have hardly been in the office at all, but they never get to the triggers because the employer has actually agreed to ignore that absence, and that's too cautious an approach generally. So dealing with long-term absence, again, be proactive. Obviously, somebody who's off ill, you do need to agree how much you're going to contact them. Being proactive is not bugging them every week, but having a good plan for staying in contact and looking for proactive steps that you can take. considering reasonable adjustments, and don't sit out periods when an employee is on full sick pay. You can move things along, and there should still be efforts made to look at how you can support someone returning, and don't leave it until sick pay has run out. So thank you very much for joining us today. That is actually the end of the formal presentation, and the dog barking, and again, apologies for that. And I know we've had some sound issues, so all has not gone perfectly, but hopefully you still found it a really useful session.